sort of when I teach this class sometimes in college, I go through this whole thing called rectification, talking about how different scientific systems in different parts of the world learn to have naming systems so they could sort of know what they're talking about before they went into debate with one another. That, first and foremost, is why we do this. It's for people to understand what you mean when you say a specific organism's name. We now have only one way to do that, and that's the binomial nomenclature, as you'll see in a minute. So all of this stuff's just sort of trivia, but basically I want to compare the binomial names to the names that we use, our forenames and our surnames. When you have a genus name, that's the first, that's your surname. And when you have your species name, that's sort of your forename. I'll go through that in a little bit. So the way that this works is when we use a binomial nomenclature, we use a two-word name. What we're doing is we're basing it on a species concept. In biology, we talk about the BSC, a biological species concept. That means how we designate one organism or type of organisms. So the way that we do it now is they're organisms that can reproduce with one another in nature and produce fertile offspring. It doesn't always work because of a lot of things. First of all, it lacks some amount of specificity. There are groups that are definitely distinct that are not species in that way, meaning they can produce fertile offspring with each other, but they can also with another group that we might call a species. And so this kind of species concept can impact the way we designate money for conservation and the way we go about trying to conserve species. And then this also doesn't work well with asexual species. So the species concept doesn't work there at all. We use a thing called core genomes to try to figure, we're using a thing called core genomes when we're looking at asexual species. All right, so, and this is just to give you an example of what I was talking about with the conservation. So the gray wolf is either a hybrid, the red wolf is either a hybrid between the coyote and the gray wolf, or it is the result of a regionally isolated species of gray wolf. Now, if it is this, then it can be fully conserved under our current laws. If it's this, it has no protection at all, because a hybrid is offered no protection. It's not considered a species, so it doesn't fit under that definition. So this is why this kind of stuff matters and why we try to get our species names really correct. All right, so the other reason we come up with this system is that common names can be extremely regional, they can be local. You might have them existing in just one part of a state even, where everybody calls a species by a name. So can anybody tell me what this animal is?
Bird.
Is that a bird? And then what about this one here?
Bird.
Yes, bird is good. You guys are doing great with bird.
I heard it's the word.
It is the word. All right, so you kind of got some bird there, right? So the first were all names used in different places for the guppy. So you could see how confusing that can be, all of those names being bandied about regionally, and the others for the mallard, as they say in Bretagne. And so that's another reason we use binomial nomenclature, because you can be very specific about these. You cut through all the nonsense with common names. All right. Binomial system. Carl, right, 1753, he publishes Species Plantarum, and in that book, he basically lays out this system. Binomial comes from Latin, bi, two, and nomos, names, and so it's a two-name system. First, we have the genus. That is a group of closely related species. And then a species is, as we discussed just a minute ago, the largest group of animals in which any two individuals can theoretically reproduce if allowed space and time and the proper mood. So the genus is all about relationships. When we use that name, we're talking about what else it's related to. Closely related species, closely related groups. And then the species is the identification of the specific type of organism within that big family. So in our common names, as I said, Linnaeus is the surname. It identifies Carl here as one of a group of individuals known as the Linnaeuses, and the forename, Carl. identifies him as who he is, which one of the Linnaeuses. And there is the binomial system. Now I want to talk about where science went before we created this, because right before we created this, they were also trying to come up with scientific names, but they didn't really have an idea of how to do that in the simplest way possible. So they came up with some crazy stuff like this. It was overly long, really descriptive. They wanted to put everything in so that you'd be able to understand. So this series of Latin words and Greek words there basically means an apis with downy hairs, somewhat gray thorax, a brown abdomen, and smooth hind legs with fringe on either side. So what animal are we talking about there?
Some kind of bee.
That's it. Yeah, it's the honeybee. And that is the scientific name that it had before binomial nomenclature came in. All right. And there's the honeybee. And now we see it has a two-name system, Apis mellifera. Now these words, each one of these is derived from something else. If you know the derivation, if you know something about the words, then you can kind of connect it to other things. That's a good way to learn Latin names as you're going through. If you can figure out what the individual words mean, that can help you remember them because it can be interesting and linked to other words that you know. So just to give you an example here, mellifera, right, comes from two Greek words coming together, melit, honey or sweetness, and, meant figuratively, and fair from pharos, meaning carrying. So not pharos, but pharos, carrying. So you see some of the other words that use some of that stuff. Aqua, fur, right? Pharos, water carrying. Transfer, to carry between. And then, mildew, honey-dew, right? That's what it literally means. Honey, mellet. And then cane honey is what caramel literally means. I mean, the word for it. Caramel is cane honey, and then mellifluous, sweet sounding. Again, all coming from this Greek root. So this is kind of one of the ways you can start to learn these kind of things and remember them by linking words with other words that you know, and you say, oh, mellifera, honeybee, if you can remember mildew or mellifluous or caramel, and save that in your memory. Whoops. All right, so we also use these to stick them into, as we've talked about genus and species here, and then we go up from there to the family, the order, the class, the phylum, the kingdom, and the domains. These names help us to organize those. And we also have words that are derived from Latin or Greek for all of these as well. And then we use those in a specific way with specific endings so that people who are trained in this kind of thing can immediately see it and be like, that's an order name. I know this is an order of animals. That's a class when you see them based on the endings. We're not going to get into too much detail about that because it's way too much to remember. But just in general, it's a good thing to know. You'll start to see certain endings for words and you'll start to know that, oh, that's a higher order classification. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about creating scientific names. And I think this is interesting to me because it sort of explains why things get the names that they get and why some things have to have their names changed. Mike is always dealing with name changes, and the plant people always dealing with name changes in different groups. And this is why this happens, because they have to rectify different sources of information coming in. So first of all of these binomial names that we have are regulated by a number of groups. And these groups kind of store all of those names. They also determine which ones are valid. So you have an international code of zoological nomenclature, and then you have an international code of nomenclature for algae, fungi, and plants, the ICNAFP, and then you even have one for cultivated plants. These are the three main ones that people refer to. So as you can see, they're pretty old, right? 1895, 1864, these groups have been up. And they review all the new names that come in, and they make sure they don't violate any rules. So here, for a little side trivia question, what do these two species have in common?
Aquarius.
Yes, they share a genus name. They are what are called homonyms. This time, sometimes you come across this. Zoological and botanical taxonomy, as I just explained, are managed by two different organizations. And what that means is they don't have to use the same names. So if somebody uses Aquarius for an animal, as it is here for the water strider, then someone else can use Aquarius also for a plant, as they did here really recently with the sword plants when they redid Echinodorus and created Aquarius from the burnt remains of that once regal family. So that's called a homonym when you see that happen. And there's also something called a hemihomonym. So in these cases, the animals share both the genus and the species name. There's just about between 50 and 60. I found 50. But I understand there are more if I expanded my search outside of my comfort groups. But this is just one example that I found. An orchid and a little pupfish, a little Peruvian pupfish, share the exact same names. And that's called a hemihomonym. Just a little bit of trivia. All right, so let's talk about when people go to name stuff, the naming rights. So one thing is the law of priority. And that just says the first name stands unless it's eliminated because it's invalid. So if a species is discovered a second time, you revert back to the original name. And all of us actually know an example of this because in 1877, Othniel Marsh, one of our most famous paleontologists, found a dinosaur and he named it Apatosaurus. And then in 1897, they found the same species, but a smaller version, and they named it Brontosaurus. And I grew up calling it Brontosaurus until the name reversion. And this is exactly why it happened, because of the law of priority, which applies in taxonomic nomenclature for animals or plants. All right. Okay. Then we're going to talk about making names. So as I said, I'm not teaching you Latin, and that's because binomial nomenclature is not Latin. The terms that we use for binomial names can come from any language, in fact. We use Latin rules for how we structure them, but they can come from Greek, they can come from anything. So two Latin terms in Homo sapiens used there, so that's purely Latin. Calophosphermum mopane, Greek term for resin and seed jammed together to create the genus name, but the species, mopane, is from the Bantu language in Africa. So you get this a lot, and you'll be like, what's this Latin term? Well, it's not Latin. And it's also one of the reasons that it's hard to teach pronunciation of binomial nomenclature, because some of the words are not pronounced according to Latin or Greek rules because they come from another language. So, and then other sources, other ways you can name stuff. Here's names of people. Acrotaphus Jackie Chani, right? Wasp named after Jackie Chan. And Odocoilus virginianus acapulcensis. Who knows what this is? Nope. No one? Super common, and yet you wouldn't recognize the name. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't recognize the name, but it is just a deer. It's just the white-tailed deer, but the version, the subspecies from Acapulco, which really is not doing well. So if you're out there, drop some seeds or something. Anyway, so that's another way that you make names, is by just taking a place name so that you can geographically identify where the species is from. All right, so who makes up the names? Biologists and taxonomists make up these names, and they have to follow all these rules. First of all, they have to follow the grammar and convention rules, which we'll discuss in a second. Then they have to do all their research. They have to look at all the past stuff so that they can be sure their name is okay with the law of priority. And then the name has to be consistent with other named species in the genus. And then the proposed name has to be published. And that's the most important part. Once it's published, it's part of the record, and that's what makes it official. So if it's unpublished and it's just in somebody's mind, they haven't managed to get their work out there, so be it. And outside of these rules, you can do whatever you want in naming your species, and people do weird stuff. Lots of names have a scientist's last name in them because they're honoring the scientist that either discovered them or was connected to research in that species. But they also honor celebrities, all sorts of stuff. So we'll look at some fun names. Pizza Pie. Entomologist Neil Evenheis is crazy, and he does all of his names are nuts. He also has Pizzeria, Pizza Cake, Theory of Relativity, which is an amazing one, but got its name changed. So anyway, he's nuts, and he does that with pretty much everything he names. Dracorex Hogwartsia, so Dragon King of Hogwarts is what that translates to. Leperinus Enye, this is from Enya, named for Enya, who sang the song Orinoco Flow. Spongiforma squarepantii is a mushroom that they found in Malaysia a while ago. And then this one is kind of interesting on the top. The joke is actually in the Latin itself, Eucrita melanolimnetes, which translates into the creature from the Black Lagoon. So it's like the name itself doesn't really mean much, but the joke is hidden in the Latin. And that's something that, as taxonomists, we would really always love to do, if you could, with your name, is make a joke that only other taxonomists would laugh at.
Named a fish after Darth Vader.
Yeah.
Because it lives in a volcano.
And
he lost his famous duel in the volcano.
And they had all those. They had a moth and a fish named for Sauron in the last few years as well. All right, so this is where I'm going to go over some grammar, and don't try to memorize this. So that's not really the point. If you want to go back and look at this presentation, you can. This is just sort of general introductions to some of the grammar principles. So first, just to say, when you have a genus name, the structure that we use for those is, in Latin terms, that of a named noun. It's called the nominative case or the naming case. And that's why they have the structure that they do. So, and this also is important because, Latin uses genders, so you apply different genders to the ends of the word, and that's based on this nominative case or naming case. So here are some of the endings over here. And again, I'm not going to go super over this, but just to give you an example, you see some genus names here, and you see that they fit with those endings, which are in the nominative case. So, and then you see where they are, if they're feminine, or if they're masculine, or if they're neuter. So Cyprinodon, right, is neutral and nominative. And then up there, and Crassius for the goldfish, that has the US ending. It is a genus name that is masculine, okay? And so that's the structure that genus names always take. Now, species names can take a couple of different structures. All right, so there's 3 forms for species names. One, it can be an adjective. And this, you can read all that if you want, but this is basically just to say that when they create a species name, they can use the Latin rules that they use for an adjective. And the word functions as an adjective if used in this way, meaning it modifies the noun, right? So Microtenopoma nanum, right? Nanum means dwarf. So this name means dwarf Microtenopoma. So a lot of species names are adjectives that modify the noun. They just go backwards. So you're saying, here's a Microtenopoma, this is the dwarf one. Here's a Microtenopoma, this is the shiny one, that kind of stuff. So when the species name is an adjective, the gender of the word matches that of the genus. And that's why you'll end up seeing these kind of endings. These are feminine endings in the adjective in this form, masculine endings and neuter endings. And again, not something you memorize unless you do Latin, not something you memorize, but just to show you. All right, so this is an example of that. Example of gender in fish naming. The original name of the convict cichlid was Cyclosoma nigrofasciatum, right? Meaning black-striped cyclosoma. Cyclosoma at the end had a feminine name ending with the A, right? Nigra fasciatum ends in the neuter Feminine, neuter, they went together. So when that was put in archocentris ends in the masculine us. So they had to change, they had to have either neuter, they had to change it to masculine. So they did, and change it from nigra fasciatus, add the us on there. That's why names change sometimes. And you see them and they have those different endings, because when the genus changes, the gender of the genus changes, and then you change the gender of the species. All right. So, ensis. Let's talk about ensis for a minute. Whenever you see ensis, and I know you all see this in fish names all the time, it can be masculine, feminine, or neuter. It's called a toponym, and it's used to say, to refer to a specific place. Acrensis here is the Acra River, and that's what that means, from that river. So in that one word, that species name is itself the toponym, saying from this. And so you'll see that a ton in species names, and that's always what it means, E-N-S-I-S. Okay? All right, and then appositive nouns. So this is a noun that's just related to the first noun. Remember I said the genus names are nouns. They're named nouns. And in this case, we pick a species name that just kind of goes with the first one. Panthera leo. They both mean lion. Panthera originally meant lion, leo means lion, so it's just lion, lion. And you get a lot of that, and when that happens, they do it in this way. And then there's other rules for appositive nouns when you have species names, but you don't have to match the gender. So Panthera is feminine, Leo is masculine, it didn't matter. All right. And then you have genitive. That's possessive. All right? You see this a lot in fish names too, because this is how we say that this was so-and-so's blank. So Limia garnieri, right? Garnier's Limia. It's a possessive form of the word that says this was the Limia that belonged to this particular Emmanuel Garnier, who was the director of fisheries in Haiti. And anyway, the gender follows the gender of the person being named. So see, the rules get even more confusing, because here you're using the gender of the person's being named, not the gender of the genus name. So this is why I tell people don't bother memorizing it, because you'll run into stuff like this. The point is here really to look at these situations where we have these possessive nouns. All right, and then this is time for a joke. A Roman walks into a bar and asks for a Martinez. And the bartender says, "You mean a martini?" And the guy says, "If I wanted more than one, I would have said so." It's the wrong crowd, but US or I. So Martinez would have been singular in the Latin rules. And this is the kind of joke you get in fourth year Latin class. All right. Now I want to talk about pronunciation, because this is the main question I get on scientific names. There are several different sort of approaches to the pronunciation of Latin. Classical, ecclesiastical, and then sort of this anglicized Anglo-Latin. I generally use the Anglo-Latin. The pronunciations tend to be more natural feeling for me and match up with my knowledge of other languages. So in classical Latin, for instance, when you have an I in classical, it would be pronounced I. In ecclesiastical, E and I in Anglo-Latin. Then the double I in classical Latin, E again in ecclesiastical Latin, which really doesn't have a lot of variation, and then EI in Anglo-Latin. And then AE is pronounced A, or E, if you go down those. And then EAE, which is one that comes at an end of a lot of words, can be confusing, either AI, E, or EE. So, crypt wendet, okay, this one, wendet I, wendet E, or wendet EI. And none of those are actually incorrect at all, if you were to say any of those. They all work. I mean, you might have one that's more accepted than others in the trade, but it really doesn't matter that much. But these are examples of why you might hear people pronouncing them different, even scientists. Some think that we need to go with these different pronunciations for various rules, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so to give you an example here, this genus name, the first from the Greek for spiny, and the second part of the word is from the Greek for bottle. It means spiny bottle. It refers to the little seed, things that hold the seeds. So ways that you typically hear this pronounced is echinodorus, 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 or echinodorus, echinodorus, echinodorus. Those are all the ways that you hear this combination pronounced. And all of them are fine, so it doesn't really matter what you do with this. Like I said, none of these words are Greek and none of them are Latin. And the thing that you really want to do is you just want to have coherence is more important. So if you could learn to spell if you could learn the correct spelling rather than the correct pronunciation, that's more important. Communicating what you are talking about is the most important thing. So rather than focusing on pronunciation, just know if you can get the spelling down, that's much more important. Okay, and then quickly going through, I've given you some of the stuff there. When you have in orders, for plants, when you're talking about the order of a species, it's iforms or iformes. That is the ending. Cyprinodontiforms or Cyprinodontiformes, Perciformes, Perciforms, right? These are orders. Those are orders specifically of fish. In plants, we use ales at the end, A-L-E-S. And then you'll see that all the time too. Nymphales, poales, zingiberales, camelinales. When we go to suborders, right, you see this, oidea or oidii. And with plants, it's either inia or inii, and some examples, in the anabantoids. These are just some examples of suborders or superfamilies. So one step above the family and one step below the order. Coherent grouping that fits in there. And these are the endings you always get on them. So whenever you see iformes or iforms, that is going to be an order of animals. All right. And then same with families and subfamilies. We've all seen Cyclididae, Bagrididae, Cyprinidae, which can be Idae, Idea, Idi. You can pronounce them either of those ways. That's I-D-A-E. And the equivalent in plants for a family is A-C-E-A-E. Typically in the taxonomic botanical trade, which is what I'm most familiar with, you will get ACE on that. That's how they pronounce it. Nymphaceae, Ponderiaceae, Nagidaceae, Hydrokerataceae. And then in subfamilies, you'll get INAE, INI, 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 either of those, and then oidi or oidii. And then that's for plants. So families and subfamilies. The point that I'm trying to make here is that they always have the same ending. So these are just 8 different endings that I've showed you for order, family, and superfamily, subfamily, and they always are going to have those endings, suffixes. Okay, and then I want to talk about some of the ways that these things go wrong. I've talked about how we want to use these binomial nomenclature so that we can keep things straight. We all know what we're talking about. But there are lots of examples where that doesn't go right. Hypomesis transpacificus, which means across the Pacific, is only found in the San Francisco Bay. But when they discovered the delta smelt, they were assuming a range that it didn't have. So a lot of times this stuff happens, but because the names are difficult to change, they've been published in this and this and that, they will not generally go correct this, and it'll just sort of remain. And people remember it oftentimes by the mistake. Labidochromis caeruleus, from the Latin meaning dark blue, is the yellow lab, right? So a species was named from specimens that looked quite different from the specimens they later started finding. And that's where they ended up giving it a name that sort of is mistaken. So while this system's pretty good, often you end up with artifacts like that. And that reflects the history of our discovery, like which species we discovered first or where we discovered them. All right. A little bit of Aristotle action. And we're going to talk about this. So what do these words mean? Aculeatus, right? And we see several species that have variations on aculeatus. And I can tell you that the derived terms are acute and acumen. So what do we think that aculeatus means?
Sharp.
Oh, do we?
Sorry.
Well, he's correct, folks. Actually, it means sharp, also means spiny. It can be used for a stinger. It has been used in all these ways. So acute, having a sharp angle, acumen, sharpness of mind. And then we see all those species all have that. So each one of them had some sharp, prickly, or angular feature, and that was used when they named them. Costatus. Derived terms, coast, costal, not coastal, but costal, and accost. What do we think? Anyone? For 2 points. Okay. Possessing ribs or ribbed. All right, so Hygrophila, Panelopus, all of these are, have some sort of structure that means they're ribbed. So, from accost, coming up on someone's side is what that actually means, what it actually translates to. Costal, having to do with the ribs in medicine. And also coast comes from this. It is the rib of the continent. So all from that same word. All right, boom, elegans. Stuff that comes from this is elite, election. Anyone know? Well, we got some handsome, tasteful, and elegant critters there. Just to point out here, this ISSIM gets put into a lot of names, and it means the most. So when you put that together with elegant, it just means the most elegant. So the most elegant Euphonia, the most elegant Dracophyllum. See? And election comes from elegere, which is the root of elegans, means to choose. So it's the one that you choose. And elite, chosen because of its whatever. All right, next up. Griseus. Anyone? Grizzled comes from it, but not grizzly. No? Gray. The gray squirrel. Derived terms, grizzled means gray or having a little bit of gray, but grizzly comes from an old English word. It's Germanic, it means terrible. The grizzly bear means terrible bear, not gray bear. That cactus, by the way, is super cool. All right. Humulus. There's a Lepomis that has this one, a Homolomena. Andre, do you grow that one? Words that come from this: humus, humility, humiliate. Anyone? It is small, humble, or low. These are just some of the common ones that you'll see a lot. So often this is the smallest in a group. Acerodon, humulus is the one of the, it's actually, I think it's like third in that group. Humiliate, make someone feel low or small. Humility, modest view of oneself. Reticulata, very common. Anyone?
Spotted.
Seems like it would mean spotted, but it means reticulated, which actually is a little bit different. So a reticule is a little handbag. And this kind of shape here, where you have these little like irregular sort of structures, stuff like that, or the little scales that you see on some fish where the lines in between the scales are real clear, and so you see the shapes that look like that. That's what they're talking about, little handbags. So there's another word for spotted, but this one means reticulated, and it comes from little net, basically. And you see that all the time as super common inclusion in species names. And then scalare, so scale comes from this, the term scale. And we see it in the angelfish, in the fence lizard, in some of that woodpecker, some rat snakes, and scale. But it's not what you might think. Scale in fish scale comes from skell, which is a Germanic word. But the word here, scale, is scale as if to scale a ladder or to climb. And so that's what scalare means. It means like a ladder. So here, lines of the ladder, there, the rungs of the ladder, same there. And that's where you get those names. All right, and that's it for my talk. I do have some other fish. I do have some other words here that we see quite a lot. Repens, which the root is repent, to lower oneself to seek forgiveness. Palustrous basically means of the swamp. Praecox means the first or best. Striatus, you see that a lot, striatum, striata, and that one means just like to have like a narrow channel in it, so it's usually one that has a groove in its body. Tropicalis, ortho, nitidus, navis, all of these are really common ones that you see, and I just wanted to link them to some of these other words. You can kind of see how we get these. Speciosa, for instance, something that catches attention. It's the same root as spectacle. So that the word actually meant, attention getting, not species. Okay, so don't memorize, learn gradually. As you encounter animals, try to memorize that single one, and then maybe even try to learn a little bit about the word that's in it and see if that can help you remember it by linking it to something else that you remember. Focus on the spelling and not pronunciation, and don't pay attention to the pedants, the people that correct you all the time and correct everybody when they use Latin incorrectly. Don't worry about that at all. It's not the important part about this. It's just about having conversations with people who like similar things and getting clear about what we're talking about with each other. Okay, that's it. Thanks, folks. I'll now sing a song in Latin. Yep.
Early on in your talk, you said that species means any two within that species can interbreed.
Yeah, so a species is a group. The most common biological species concept that we have now is that it's a group of animals, the largest group of animals in which any two could interbreed. Now, like I said, that has problems, though, because there are things where there are groups of animals where they could interbreed, but we know that they're different enough that we still want to tell them apart. And that's when you get into subspecies and stuff like that. A good example would be the red wolf and the gray wolf and the coyote. They can all interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So are none of those species? Well, we know that they're different enough that, at least from a conservation standpoint, we'd like to keep them around in their current forms. We don't want to just have one wild dog of the Americas. So, but yeah, generally speaking, the breeding is how it's defined. There are other ways to do it. Peter Raven, who used to run the botanical garden, used a niche concept where a species was defined as a certain number of variables all coming together, and any animal that fit that was within a species. Gary, did you have a question? Exactly. It's not enough of a species concept, actually. There's lots of things that isolate animals, and what we often don't understand about species is that what you're seeing is an animal in a snapshot in hundreds of thousands of years of its time on Earth. So at the point that you see it, it might have been isolated from neighboring populations for, let's say, a few thousand years or less. And in that time, it's taken on unique physical traits and even behavioral traits, but they haven't developed what we call an isolating mechanism yet, a biological isolating mechanism that would prevent them from interbreeding with other populations. Once those biological isolating mechanisms have evolved, then those populations could mix, and the species would stay apart. So when that hasn't happened, though, you still have what I would still describe as species, what I think you would describe as species, because they've been geographically isolated, they're behaviorally isolated, even though they could in potential breed. Yep. Yes, DNA is definitely used to make some of those separations. Old school taxonomy, like the type I learned in school, is giving way to a lot of DNA testing more and more and more as it becomes more feasible to do. And now they do all these scale studies and stuff, and they find relationships that are very different than what they thought they were, which I think is great. I mean, that's essentially what you're going to do. Core genomes are going to be the future of the species concept. Will just be a set of core genomic traits, and we'll use those to define the species, even though if in the wild, maybe they could interbreed. Anyone else? Nope. All right. Thank you.